Hello, my name is Phoebe Shorter, and I will be presenting on my first authored paper, Attachment Styles Impact on Loneliness and the Motivations to Use Social Media. If you would like to read this paper, you can view it in Computers and Human Behavior Reports Journal under the DOI attached above. So the goals, highlights, and findings of this study are presented below. So the goal of the overarching study was to examine how attachment style impacts the time spent on social networking sites, otherwise known as SNS in the context of this study. And also we wanted to know what the motives behind social media usage was, and if feelings of loneliness were related to that relationship of social media usage and attachment styles. To the best of our knowledge, this is the first study to look at each individual element in a holistic manner, where other studies have looked at one or two separately. We had a couple of hypotheses for this study. Firstly, we hypothesized that individuals with an anxious attachment style would spend more time using social media compared to participants with other attachment styles, such as avoidant and secure. And we further hypothesized that those with the anxious attachment style would use social media more than others to decrease feelings of loneliness. Some of the highlights of the study, which are below, will be further discussed later in the presentation, such that we did find that using social media to decrease loneliness is influenced by attachment style type, and that the severity of loneliness impacts the motivation to use social media to decrease those feelings. And surprisingly, we found that time spent on social media was not affected by either of the other elements. So to get into it, attachment styles in this study were defined as three types: secure, anxious, and avoidant, with anxious and avoidant being grouped into the insecure attachment label. When children are forming relationships with their parent or bonds, they are also forming attachments. And based on how the caregiver responds to needs, ultimately determines the secure, anxious, or avoidant attachment style that they are likely to develop. This is all theoretical, such that secure attached people are more likely to have social engagement and feel secure with their parents and other partners, where avoidant attached people are more likely to avoid social interactions and feel discomfort with feeling close to others, while anxiously attached individuals are likely to crave that social connection while simultaneously rejecting it at the same time. These types of attachments do impact relationship development, interpersonal skills, and forms of communication. And a form of communication we specifically looked into was social media. We wanted to see how social media and attachment were related. And other studies have found that those with insecure attachments use social media to cope and socialize with others. Now, we do want to address the fact that sometimes using social media too much has a negative impact, such that it may be connected to loneliness. Some studies have found that it's led to loneliness. Others have found that there's a significant relationship with loneliness. And we wanted to look at what this relationship was and if there was a sense of motivation to use social media to decrease loneliness. That was previously found by another study, but we wanted to look further into it with attachment styles included. We recruited 162 participants through university classes. They participated for extra credit, and they completed surveys and questionnaires through Qualtrics. The mean age for our sample was around 22 years old, and the majority of our sample was female, Caucasian, were full-time students. They were not involved in Greek life, and 46% of them were seniors. You can see in the graphical representations below the frequencies and distributions of each demographic I previously listed. We used 4 types of scales. Experiencing close relationships scale revised looks at how avoidant or anxious attached style qualities appear in an individual. It's a very short survey, and the cutoffs are distinguished below. Those with less than a 3.9 were declared to have secure attachment qualities, while anybody scoring higher on each subscale was grouped into their anxious or avoidant category. Motives for using social networking sites was 4 items that was derived from a previous longer survey. And these 4 items specifically focused on how loneliness was a motive for using social media. And in order to measure loneliness, we used the UCLA Loneliness Scale version 3, and we categorized 3 types of loneliness based on severity and scores, those with being low or no loneliness, moderate loneliness, and high. And finally, time spent on social media in hours per day was recorded using 1 item on a sliding scale to determine more accurate readings on hours spent on social media rather than categories. The results of this study were quite promising. There was no significant difference found between attachment styles and hours spent on social media, which was quite peculiar, but we will go into that further in the discussion section. There was a significant difference in attachment style and the likelihood to use social media to decrease feelings of loneliness, such that those who were anxious were much more likely to use social media or were more motivated to use social media to decrease loneliness in comparison to those with an avoidant or secure attachment styles. There's also a significant effect found of attachment style on feelings of loneliness, such that secure attachment or people with a secure attachment was related to significantly less loneliness in comparison to their anxious and avoidant peers. I also want to point out that there's no differences in loneliness severity amongst the insecure attached types. Furthermore, a simple linear regression showed that loneliness did not have an effect on SNS usage either, and that a Pearson correlation did demonstrate that there was a positive connection and correlation between time spent and the likelihood to use it. So this is saying that the more that someone is motivated to use social media, the more likely they will use it. We also found that there was a difference with loneliness severity and the likelihood to use it, which was pretty clear and straightforward, but we did want to run a test on it, such that low levels of loneliness were less likely to use social media to decrease those feelings in comparison to moderate and high. And I do want to point out there was no differences between the moderate and high. And you can see that here in these two graphs. These are graphical representations of the motives to use social media to decrease feelings of loneliness across attachment styles and loneliness severity. And you can tell that anxiously attached individuals have a much higher likelihood of being motivated to use it. And with the low, moderate, and high loneliness, you can see those with low are less likely to use it. So what does it all mean? We wondered why the relationship between loneliness scores and SNS usage and hours wasn't correlated. And we did have a big confound in the study, such that there was a big history effect due to the fact data was collected during the COVID-19 pandemic and during the United States presidential election. Also, as we were on lockdown and students were online taking classes, it was very likely that they were using their phones and SNS regularly to have communications with others, but also to gain information on what was going on in the world at the time. We did find that attachment styles was connected to loneliness, which has previously been established in the literature, but it's nice to see it here as well, such that securely attached participants are less lonely than others, and that there was an increased use of social media and being motivated to use that to decrease loneliness, and that was positively correlated with attachment styles. Loneliness severity did matter when considering motives, such that high loneliness was correlated with was shown to be used more likely to use decreased loneliness. And SNS appears to be a tool to address loneliness, especially in anxiously attached individuals. So what makes them different than the other attachment styles? Well, securely attached individuals are less lonely and are less likely to seek that validation and socialization through social media. And avoidant individuals are less likely to reach out to others anyway and are not using social media to meet any social needs. Therefore, SNS provides anxiously attached individuals with better opportunities to seek social validation and the connection they crave. There were quite a few limitations that I'd like to point out. As I previously mentioned, data was collected during the COVID-19 pandemic and the United States presidential election. So this may have confounded our data regarding time spent on social media. But also, data was collected using convenience sampling. Students selected themselves into this study as they were the ones that wanted the credit. So we may not be able to reflect to the population we actually intended to understand. And there's also a risk of sampling error when using this kind of sampling. Furthermore, the sample was predominantly white, female, and they were all in college. So there are issues with generalization across cultures and communities. However, the study was a great big step into connecting all of these three elements together, such that these studies imply that social media can be a useful tool and aid for reducing loneliness in specific individuals, specifically those with anxious attachment styles. And this can be used in the clinical field, such that you could use social media as a mental health worker to help engage your clients in more socialization and monitor social media usage in a healthy way to reduce loneliness. We'd also encourage future researchers to look beyond general SNS usage. We only looked at hours spent, but we did not look at the type of social media used. So it'd be nice to know what kind they're using and why. Are they looking for information, socialization? Are the connections they're making platonic or romantic? It would be critical to know this information. We'd also like to examine coping mechanisms and how that plays a role in this relationship, observing if there's negative forms of coping with maladaptive SNS usage and seeing if that correlates with loneliness at all. And we also suggest through future studies collect information about current living situation and perceived social support at the time of study, as this can also impact coping styles, but also impact the amount of social media usage they are engaging in. Here are the references cited throughout this presentation. And once again, if you'd like to take this a read into more depth of the study, you can find it in Computers and Human Behavior Reports using the DOI above. Thank you so much.